This second talk today is going to be, has a very provocative title, but I hope at the end that you will see that it really wasn't so provocative and it could have been actually worse. It's entitled, How the United States National Academy of Sciences Misled the World Community on Cancer Risk Assessment. Okay, now this is actually a human story in addition to a scientific kind of a tale. And it's kind of a human drama. There are key players in this story, and each one has a little role, and we'll go into what their roles are. We can start with perhaps the key player, Hermann Muller. His picture will be shown next. Muller is over here in his prime, and in the next picture over here you can see Muller, the kind of the little guy in the picture, getting his Nobel Prize in December of 1946, when I was simply 4 months old. This guy over here is a colleague of Muller, Kurt Stern. He is a very distinguished professor at the University of Rochester, became similarly distinguished at the University of California at Berkeley. Very, very outstanding geneticist, very respected gentleman. Over here, the center person is Ernst Caspari. Caspari was a Ph.D. in insect behavior. He did work under the direction of Kurt Stern at the University of Rochester during the Manhattan Project, and that's what's going to be significant here. Caspari is also quite a name in the field as well. We have, of course, the female figure in this drama, Delta Uphoff, who was a undergraduate at Russell Sage College in Albany, and came to work under the direction of Kurt Stern during the Manhattan Project days, and also went out to UCal Berkeley as well. And then we have Jim Crow, who was actually one of the first graduate students of Hermann Muller at the University of Texas at Austin, and ultimately becomes a very significant player in the National Academy of Sciences that I'll be ultimately criticizing. Of all the people in the National Academy of Sciences committee that created what I'll call the travesty of the LNT, he's the only one that I actually communicated with. 4 years ago, when the New England Patriots were in the Super Bowl, or 5 years ago, whatever it was, I was watching the game, and at the halftime, I was working on this paper criticizing Muller, and I said, I wonder what Jim Crow would think. And I know he's about 95 years old. I don't know where his head is. How good is his memory, what have you. And I wrote him an email at the halftime, and I said, would you be ever interested in reading this critical paper about Hermann Muller, your old mentor, etc.? And he wrote me back within 3 seconds. And so I have like a 15 or 20 or so email correspondence preserved between me and Jim Crow. He's a beloved guy, and I suspect after reading my paper, which is coming out next week, some of his former PhDs and postdocs might not think too kindly of me, but because all these ones in the picture here, none of them are going to come out looking too good. Okay. Although I don't have anything against any of them, actually. Warren Weaver, he is a significant guy with the Rockefeller Foundation. He directed the first National Academy Committee that established LNT, essentially. We'll talk about him. In my effort to try to come up with information on Warren Weaver, what he knew, what he didn't know, I contacted his 84-year-old daughter, who is a very esteemed writer. I'm trying to come up with anything she might have on her dad. And as it turns out, we developed a good, I couldn't tell her what I was really about, but we developed some sort of an interesting aspect to communication on what she writes about. George Beadle, a subsequent Nobel Prize winner in 1958, becomes the president of the University of Chicago, and was a key player in this National Academy BEAR 1, BEAR 2 committees. Detlef Bronk, who was the president of the National Academy of Sciences, president of Rockefeller University, and he is the last picture here, the players in the game. But we're really talking about why does the government believe in LNT? That's what we're really going to try to get to, how we came to this belief. Well, actually, it all starts with Hermann Muller. Hermann Muller was a University of Texas at Austin professor, and he had been on this search for trying to induce a mutation in fruit flies. And he tried, ever since he was just a green kid going to graduate school at Columbia, there was this effort to try to do this. Now, why were they interested in mutation, inducing mutation? They weren't interested at all in LNT. They weren't interested in risk assessment. They were actually interested in evolution. The big players, the big question was how did life evolve? We had essentially the origin of the species with Charles Darwin in 1865, and you had Gregor Mendel being rediscovered in the 1900-ish, and we kind of had a theory of evolution. We had an idea of genes and segregation. We had an idea of what sexual reproduction could do, but we really didn't have an idea as to, evolution wasn't going to be explained by sexual reproduction. It needed some ways to induce changes. And so the fight, the prize was to be the one who could induce mutation with environmental material. And so, I mean, amongst all the other things that people were trying to figure out about genes and chromosomes and lineages and things of that nature, Muller was really going for this issue. And in 1927, Muller publishes a paper in the journal Science in which he claims to have found that high levels of X-rays can induce mutations in the genome of the male fruit fly. Now, if you go back and you look at Muller's paper, you'll be surprised to learn this is a major discovery that's going to get a Nobel Prize. And he just aces out somebody from Missouri who's working with plants, but Muller could get multiple generations very quickly. The plant guy could get one generation per year. Be that as it may, they both were honing in on this issue. But because primacy is very important, first one in gets the award. Muller gets his, I don't know how he did it, but Muller must have had a connection at the journal Science, because he publishes this major paper in Science claiming he's induced mutation with X-rays in the fruit fly genome, and he shows no data. If you go back to that 1927 paper, you read it, you tell me if you can find data in it, because there wasn't any data in it. He discussed his data, he critiqued his data, he did a lot of things in that paper, but he did not show the data. And so if you go into his, the archives of his old boss at Columbia, who was also a Nobel Prize winner, Dr. Morgan. Morgan, in a letter to one of his colleagues, says, "Oh God, he's done it again. This could be the end of his career. If he doesn't have the data to back this up, it's all over for him. This is like going this is way over the top." And so nobody knew if Muller had the data. But Muller knew. And Muller shows up over in Berlin in September of 1927 and reveals his data to a large audience at the 5th International Genetics Congress. And he basically wows the crowd, showing them his findings the first time it was unveiled. And so if you go back and you look at the timing, it really captured media for that time period, and it was a major finding. And so Muller, he became a superstar overnight in Berlin. He actually did. When he came back, there was a lot of media attention for him and the like. And so Muller begins his trek, in which we'll come back to. Muller's still not talking about a linear dose response. And actually, if you try to do this, you want to go back in and get the original data. Muller never published his original findings in a journal. He published them in a conference proceedings. I don't believe the conference proceedings was ever actually peer-reviewed. If you try to find Muller's Nobel Prize research, it's only located in one library in the US, and it's in the Brooklyn Botanical Library, actually. And if you go back and you read that, and if you can understand what he actually did and try to figure it out, I mean, you can kind of know that he has his data there, but it is sloppily written. It was put together probably on the boat over there. It was, I was told, I read that the mother of Kurt Stern typed it for him while he was over in Berlin, and he didn't, I mean, and probably somebody just took it and got a conference, got the paper, put it in a conference proceedings, and really, I've given this to multiple graduate students, other people to read this, because I can't believe what a terrible job he did writing this up. It would have never actually even been accepted for publication. Not so much on the data, but on how he did it. And I don't think anybody actually even knows this. And because how could you even find it? It's not in any library around. You have to really look for it, and not that many are interested in looking for it. Probably because other people could verify that radiation caused mutation anyways, and so it didn't become that much of an issue, and he won the prize. However, two really smart guys, physical chemists at the University of Cal at Berkeley, they were interested in big questions too, especially this guy, Gilbert Lewis. Gilbert Lewis, if you took organic chemistry, you heard of Lewis acids and Lewis bases, that sort of thing. Here's the guy, very famous physical chemist, nominated 32 times for Nobel Prize in chemistry, never got it because, from what I'm told, he had a few enemies on the board, and he probably deserved it, didn't get it. He dies, he's studying a cyanide compound at Berkeley one Saturday afternoon, and essentially, I think a flask broke, and somebody saw this little old guy laying down in the lab, and they pulled him out, and there was a fight over sending an ambulance across town to pick him up from one jurisdiction to another, and they wouldn't do it, so he didn't get to the hospital in time. This world-famous chemist dies in 1946. Be that as it may. These guys, they were interested in trying to explain evolution as well. And they took the Muller data, and they assumed that the relationship was linear at low dose. And they assumed that you could get evolutionary change from background radiation, from cosmic rays and terrestrial radiation. And if you assume that all systems responded linearly, then you could begin to explain how change occurred. And they wrote this up in an article in the journal Nature. And that's the very first time that I can find in the literature that somebody proposes a linear dose response. And it's to explain how we got here. It's not to explain risk assessment, it's how evolution, how life evolved. Well, actually, Muller doesn't agree with these people. He thinks that, based upon his work, that background radiation can only account for 1/1300th of what he observes. And he said there's no way that background radiation could actually account for evolutionary theory, even though I believe, he says, that the dose response is fundamentally linear. So actually, Muller's challenging of Olson and Lewis was actually intellectually compelling. And Olson and Lewis didn't fight back, and this evolutionary interpretation pretty much was put to the side. However, what happened was that Muller himself wanted to follow up on the dose-response relationship, and he got his two next students to do this. And they worked at very high doses, and they actually showed a linear dose response for this gonadal mutation. And so in 1930, Muller's original Nobel Prize work did not show a linear relationship, but the follow-up work actually did at high doses with his two students. So they published this work, and at some point, right around then, after seeing the data, Muller became convinced that it was true, that the dose response was linear all the way down to 0. And he didn't call it LNT, he called it the proportionality rule. It's if you go in the literature, you cannot find essentially him using LNT at all, but the similar wordage is proportionality rule. And in the 1930s, proportionality rule was actually the phrase that was used to describe what we today call LNT. And so essentially, this was his belief. Now, the interesting thing was, he didn't test low doses. He was testing doses. The lowest dose they tested was probably 200,000 to like 400,000 times above background. It was very high doses that they were testing. Yet Muller was quick to jump on the low dose linearity idea. Now, I don't know, never knew Muller, obviously, and I don't know, and everybody's different as to, I think, when do you first believe something? How much do you believe something? How restricted are your beliefs? How could Muller, very bright man, have jumped to an extrapolation over 200,000 to 300,000 or 400,000 fold? Well, he's the smartest one in the class, actually, and he did it. And so, but he had a theory, and he started hanging out with a physicist, really bright physicist, and he took a leave over to Germany with a Fulbright in 1932, and some of the people in Germany were very intellectual, and they would bring together some of the best physicists like Niels Bohr and others, and they would just meet for weeks at a time and have intellectual discussions. And Muller and the physicist decided to work together to develop new theories on dose response. And the physicist had developed a kind of like a target theory. And the target theory is very reductionist mechanical theoretical approach, but Muller's data fit right into this. And so what happened was that they developed a mathematical model that tried to describe the shape of the dose response, assuming different numbers of hits on the genome. And in this particular picture here, this is right from their original publication. You go from, well, this is like a single hit, and this is up to 50 hits. And if you follow the single hit, it shows a linear dose response. If you assume 50 hits, you really have a threshold dose response, and then you have kind of everything in between. And so what happened when Muller worked with these people in Germany, they worked together and they took this linear dose response and they married it to a concept of single hit. And what came out of that was the creation of the linear single hit model for dose response. And so it was initially published in a journal in 1935, and the journal was a new journal, and it only had 4 issues, and then it went out of print. And nobody actually got to, and I never really even knew that it existed for many, many years. It was written in German. My German is definitely not good enough to translate it. And basically was known by a certain number of people, but this linear, non-linear single hit theory emerged out of a creative situation between Muller, a couple of geneticists in Germany, and the physics community, actually. Then Muller, in 1933, essentially when Hitler took over in Germany. Muller essentially ran for his life, actually, and went to the Soviet Union and was there for 4 years. And then Muller was always outspoken, so he criticized Lysenko that Stalin knew about, and the next thing you know, Muller is running for his life. And Muller ended up over at the University of Edinburgh, and he then is there for a couple years, and World War II starts. And in this country, everybody was being drafted into World War II. And because Muller had pretty much rejected U.S. capitalism in favor of a socialistic perspective, he was persona non grata, really, in this country, despite his acclaim. And the only place that would offer him a position was in my town, Amherst, Massachusetts, at Amherst College, this nice, great undergraduate college. While half the biology department was going in to serve in the war, Muller came back. He's a little bit too old to serve, and he came there. And they had actually 2 other geneticists who were pretty good. It was actually a very unusual situation. And so Muller was there from 1940 to 1945, and then after the war, they didn't renew his contract. In 1946, he gets the Nobel Prize at the University of Indiana. I'm sure they regretted not extending his contract at Amherst. But as it turns out, I was able to track down where the old guy lived, 62 Gray Street, and could try to track out where he lived and so forth and so on. I think it's student housing right now for, in the sense of apartments for kids. They probably don't know, the great thoughts that came out of 62 Gray Street. But I can just kind of picture this little guy walking across the street over to Amherst College and so forth and so on. Well, as it turns out, Muller is, World War II is going on, and the Manhattan Project gets created. Muller's back in this country. He has a relationship with Kurt Stern from 1927 days, and he and Stern had some other interactions that worked out okay in the end, but Kurt Stern was the first person who essentially came up with significant evidence for the linear linkage of genes on a chromosome. And he published it in 1926 in some journal. In 1929, Muller comes up and claims he's the first one who has this thing and doesn't cite Stern. And yet he knows of Stern's information. Stern gets all upset, but he's a very genteel sort of guy. And he writes back to Muller and says, I was first on this, and you didn't acknowledge me. Well, why didn't you do this? I mean, I'm not really that much of a, insistent person, but really. And so Muller takes 6 weeks. I have all the correspondence between them, actually. Muller writes back, and 6 weeks later says, well, you're right. It was really wrong of me to do that. I'd like to correct the situation by writing an article to the American Naturalist and giving you credit, and I hope that's okay now. And Stern, relieved, writes him back and says, thank you. But because of that, their relationship, which could have gone really sour, was made okay again. And so that was actually significant, because the Muller said they might not have got along at all, but they got along. And so Muller's a big name in the field, but he's also a questionable guy because of his international stuff. And so Stern goes to the Atomic Energy Commission, gets permission for him to serve as a paid consultant on the Manhattan Project. And it goes forth, and they're trying to figure out actually the nature of the dose response in the low dose zone, kind of what we're still fighting about today and the nature of this talk today. And so what happens is that they have 2 projects they're supposed to look at, an acute project and a chronic project using the Drosophila. They also didn't want to just use the Drosophila. People wanted to use the mouse model because of its relevance to humans, and they chose this guy, Donald Charles, who was also a professor at Rochester, very well respected guy. In the case of Dr. Charles, he essentially used over 400,000 mice, and they had no meaningful publications concerning this. There was, in the literature that I got, the correspondence, there was always this dissatisfaction with what was going on with Charles. He wasn't sharing his work. There was issues. Eventually, Charles leaves Rochester, and eventually he commits suicide in a Manhattan hotel, very despondent, coming after a divorce and some other professional failings, and it was so I got the write-up in the New York Times and all this sort of thing with it. But actually, it's actually 400,000 mice did not impact the risk assessment at that time. It's actually pretty amazing. Pretty amazing. It actually should have been a major story in and of itself. But the work of Stern did impact risk assessment, and it's based upon the work of Stern that we came up with our LNT. Okay. Now, in the case of Stern, I said there were two basic studies. There was the acute study and the chronic study. The acute study is done by this guy, Warren Spencer, who was a professor at the College of Worcester, which is a small undergraduate school in Ohio. He had a Ph.D. from Ohio State in Drosophila biology. Very well qualified guy to work on this project. And so they did a very large scale study. It took about a year to do this. And they presented their findings. Muller is advising the whole time. Muller provides a lot of guidance on study design, different techniques, provides his own strain of Drosophila that's used, which they're happy to use. And they get results that appear to be a linear dose response. By acute study, what I mean is they gave essentially exposures that ranged from as short as about 4 or 5 seconds to about several minutes. It was a very, very wide dose range, but it was acutely done. So had a very high dose rate that we're looking at here. And so basically he came up with a linear dose response. Now, I have correspondence with, I have Muller's criticisms of the Stern study. I have all their interactions back and forth. And I'll get back to the criticisms that I'm listing here a little bit later. But whatever it is, they got a linear dose response, so they believed, and this confirmed what they thought would happen. They thought that there'd be a linear dose response. That's Muller and Stern and the others. The mantra of the genetics community at the time was suggesting a linear dose response. Then this guy, Ernst Caspari, goes in to do really the more significant study, because he was going to do a chronic study. So he was going to take the lowest dose, so to speak, and titrate it out over a whole lifetime. So he was actually going to be studying the exposure at 1/13,000th the dose rate as to what the lowest dose that Spencer did. And as it turns out, his data suggested a threshold, or indicated a threshold. So he didn't really want that. He knew that his boss didn't want that, but he goes in and tells Stern that in fact that's what he got. So Stern actually says that he wouldn't accept his findings. He said that the reason why you got a threshold was because your control group was reading too high, and because it's reading aberrantly high, you got a false threshold instead of a linear dose response. So tough. I don't accept your findings. So Caspari actually rolls up his sleeves and goes into the literature and finds a number of studies that in fact support that his control group was acting exactly the way it should. So then he goes back in to see Stern with the new data and says, I'm right. My control group is not acting aberrantly. It's not high. It's within the normal range. And Stern backed down, to his credit. And Stern, so Caspari won round one with his advisor. So it was supporting a threshold dose response. But as the story is, Stern might have lost that round, but he was the boss. Okay, so how is Stern going to actually make it right for LNT? He does make it right for LNT. So what he does, this is actually weird if you read the Caspari and Stern paper that's subsequently published. In the discussion of that paper, it's about a 6-page discussion. 95% of that paper is actually a discussion as to why the results of Caspari should not be accepted until they can figure out why it differed from the prior study of Spencer. So he did not deny his findings, he just said, don't believe him. It's very, very interesting. Now, this gets me back into the two studies. The Spencer study, now this is 40 years later, 50 years later, more than that, I'm going back and looking at it. And I find that the Spencer study actually has a whole bunch of problems with it that nobody ever brought out in the past. It had very poor temperature control. In fact, they didn't have even they didn't even have temperature control for the Spencer study. Temperature is a very big factor affecting susceptibility to X-ray induced mutation in this model. They had inconsistent instrument calibration. They actually they combined some groups that had the same total dose but significantly different dose rates into one group, which you can't do, and they did it. They basically had poor matching of the control groups, which were done at different times in this study and not in conjunction with the low dose groups. They had a number of problems with this that people of their caliber should have been able to pick up. But they didn't pick it up at all. I have Muller's 7-page letter to Stern and to Spencer with his comments on it. None of these criticisms that I found were ever pointed out by Muller. Okay. And it was very, very interesting. And so the story goes is that I'm writing a paper on the origin of LNT, and I hadn't really gone into this stuff. And I send out this paper to some friends to read before I submit it for publication. And I'm not really covering Muller much at all in this paper. And this guy, a geneticist, well-known guy, says, you didn't cover Muller well. You better go into him in detail, because he's really crucial, I think, but I'm not sure, in affecting the acceptance of the LNT. So that's what actually led me into going back and digging out all this primary stuff on Muller, Stern, and I had to go back to their libraries, to American Philosophical Association, buy thousands and thousands of their correspondences. They saved about everything. And there's one day, because I'm really interested, I have studied Muller at this point, and I know what his Nobel Prize taught. I can almost give it myself at this point. But part of it is that he states specifically that, and this is December 12th of 1946, he says there is no longer any possibility that a threshold model can be accepted. You have to go to a linear dose response. He closes out the possibility that the threshold exists. So I say to myself, wow, that is as absolute statement as you can ever have biologically. I said, did he see the Caspari data? Caspari's data was much better than, much scientifically stronger than Spencer's. Caspari had temperature control. Caspari had better statistical analysis. Caspari he matched everything much. He had learned from the Spencer mistakes, because Spencer's work was done a year earlier. Much better study than Spencer's. This is also interesting, going back to Stern. Stern says, we shouldn't accept the Caspari study so we can figure out why it differed from the Spencer study. So we'll accept the study that was weaker instead of the study that was stronger to guide our beliefs. Makes obviously no sense to me at all. So I'm saying to myself, Muller goes up there in front of this Nobel Prize audience, and he states emphatically that you can't believe in a threshold, no data to support it. And I'm saying the best study at the lowest dose rate ever done has just shown support for a threshold. And Muller's a consultant on that study. Muller provided the Drosophila. Muller actually designed most of the study. And I'm saying, well, I've consulted for enough companies, enough this, enough that in my life. They don't show me everything. Well, maybe they didn't show Muller. So I decided to get all the correspondence between Muller and Stern, Muller and whomever else was there at Rochester at the time. So I'm coming back to my office one night at 6 o'clock, and I got this 700-page thing sent in from the American Philosophical Association electronically. I mean, it's like a little kid on Christmas Eve, right? I said, God, this is, maybe the answer's here. So I call my wife and say, I'm not coming home until I go through these 600 things. So I'm going through, ba-boom, ba-boom, ba-boom. And then I see in September, something like September 6th, a letter to Muller. Muller, from Stern, will you read Caspari's paper? It's being typed up now, it's done. Muller writes back, says, yeah, I'll read it. Go ahead, send it ahead. September 24th, we're almost done this. He confirms again. Then on November 6th, there's a letter, we have sent you Caspari's paper. Then on November 12th, the smoking gun, as far as I'm concerned, Muller writes back and says, I just got back from a trip, I see Caspari's manuscript, I quickly went through it, I found that this challenges L&T. This challenges what we believed. This study has to be reproduced. We have to replicate it because it's so contrary to what we have believed and thought. So it told me that Muller had seen it before his Nobel Prize. Now, he hadn't gone through it in great detail, but nonetheless, he saw it, he knew what it was. He said comments to Caspari, I can't criticize Caspari because he's a good guy, a good researcher, and the like. So I knew at that point that Muller had seen it. And I'm saying to myself, well, what kind of a person would actually go in front of the Nobel Prize audience and state that there was no possibility for a threshold when he had just seen data, there was the best data to date at the time, most relevant data at the time, that showed actually that there was a possibility for a threshold. Yes, all studies need to be replicated and replicated again and again and again to prove something, but this was the best study. And he actually knew the people. He actually was the consultant. He actually supplied the Drosophila. What kind of person would do that? And do it at his Nobel Prize speech? Would you do it, Ed, if you were getting a Nobel Prize? Would you do that? What would you have said? Well, I might not have said anything about the dose response because you could talk about a lot of other things, but I might have said, I strongly believe in an LNT, but it really needs to be researched more. It's still out there as an uncertainty. But Muller was not that sort of a guy. So I kind of concluded that Muller actually was rather devious and deceptive and not very forthright and perhaps even misleading intentionally. Maybe you can even call it he lied. In any case, story goes. So yes, he does see the findings. And so this is what some of his quotes are. I've just arrived and I find the Caspari manuscript here waiting for me. I see that it's very important. The results seem so dramatically opposed to those obtained by you. That must have been the Spencer study. I wonder whether you are having any steps to have the question tested again. He's acting like a real scientist there. Test it again. That's what my old advisor said. Test it again. Okay, so Muller used his Nobel Prize speech to demand the rejection of the long-standing threshold dose response model. And what Muller says in that Nobel Prize speech is that there is no escape from the conclusion that there is no threshold. Well, I thought Caspari's offered an escape. So it was given enormous publicity and served to focus regulators, the media, and the scientific community on public health concerns associated with ionizing radiation, even at very low doses. Muller therefore knew of the significant threshold supporting study by Caspari and Stern prior to his Nobel Prize lecture, November 12, 1946. It was the strongest study to date. And he recognized that it challenged L&T and strongly supported the need for replication. Muller found, actually, I got his criticism of Caspari, but it came 5 weeks after his Nobel Prize speech in a letter written to Stern on January 14, 1947. Now, I have to tell you that I'm trying to challenge myself to see, well, how good am I as a scientist, and how do I compare against Muller? So I'm writing down my criticisms of Spencer before I read Caspari, before I read Muller's. I'm writing down my criticisms of Caspari before I read Muller's, because I want to see, is he really that much smarter than me? And how do you match up with this guy? And is he this, is he that? Who are you? How do you match up? And I said, I won't tell anybody if I'm really that stupid. And how is this thing going to come out? So So, but it's very, very interesting to see how he, as I'm not a geneticist, I'm a toxicologist. So we see things from a different viewpoint. We actually do see things from a different viewpoint. But Muller says in this letter, I have so little to suggest in regard to the manuscript. He didn't find actually any technical things to criticize in the Caspari work. And he just said that it's imperative that a repetition seems to be imperative. And so what actually happened was that when you take a look at the manuscript that was sent to him and ultimately sent to the AEC, American, Atomic Energy Commission, and when it was sent in there, it was really classified because of the Manhattan Project during that time, and nobody could see it. But if you look at the manuscript that was sent for Muller to read, and then the manuscript that was ultimately published, what you find is that there are only 2 changes in about a 40-page manuscript, and I went through every single line, every single word. And actually, the only real change in substance was in the conclusion. And the following sentence was dropped from the conclusion of that paper. And this was the sentence that was dropped. From the practical viewpoint, the results presented open up the possibility that a tolerance dose, that's another word for threshold, for radiation may be found as far as the production of mutation is concerned, end quote. In that paper, they were writing up that the data supported a threshold. After Muller read it, this sentence was removed from the conclusion. The only other change was the insertion of Muller's name in the acknowledgments. Now, I don't know if I don't have any evidence that said with Muller, sending it and crossing it out, and I have that in. I don't have that, but these are the only 2 changes from what was sent to him and what was ultimately published. Very interesting. So Stern suppressed the significance of the threshold finding, as I said before, by demanding in the discussion of the paper that the data not be accepted until it could be determined why the response was not linear, that is, why it disagreed from the Spencer acute findings. Now, the interesting thing is that what journal editor would publish a paper where somebody submits it to you and says, here's our data, but don't take it seriously until we can figure out why it differs from this other study. And actually, the other study had at least 24 major methodological differences between the 2 of them, so you could never figure out why the 2 studies different. One exposed females, one exposed males, one used this diet, one used that diet, one had this temperature, that. There were 25 different approaches. You couldn't narrow it down to really resolve why they differed. But he puts it up there like a straw man in this discussion. Well, he made it easy for himself, that is Stern. He submitted it to his own journal where he was the editor-in-chief. And he submitted it on November 25th, 1947, and was published in January of 1948. In my experience, these 2 long papers, they were never sent out for review. They were just published, Spencer and Caspari's, as he approved it. But nonetheless, I'm going to give him some credit. He then decides to try to replicate it as Muller told him to do so, but the war is ended, and Caspari goes to Wesleyan University, professor position, and Spencer goes back to the College of Worcester. He's left with nobody of high experience to take over. In comes Delta Uphoff, this beaming new graduate student in biology at Rochester, and he recruits Delta to take over the job of Caspari, to replicate the Caspari studies. So she does an initial study, and what she has is her control group. It's all breaking down to the darn control group. Her control group is reading 40% below Caspari's and what the literature says. And so what happens, we'll get into this a little bit later, but he ultimately, the 2 of them ultimately reject the interpretation. They reject the position that the data is useful. It was uninterpretable because the control group was aberrantly low, so they concluded that the experiment was not valid. And then she did a second study, and she got the same aberrantly low control group and decided it was uninterpretable. She then does a third study, which the control group came in the normal zone, but the treatment group was showing a treatment effect that was far beyond anything that was close to a linear response. It was aberrantly high. And so at the end of 3 experiments with delta, Stern was faced with, what am I going to do? It's kind of like with the Dr. Charles things. Was there anything going to come out of this Manhattan project at the University of Rochester? So basically, what did he do? Okay. So what he does is they're really trying to resolve this control group issue. So Muller writes to Stern writes to Muller, and he knows Muller has a lot of unpublished data. And he asked Muller to share his unpublished data. And as it turns out, what happens is that Muller tells him that his findings, which are substantial at Amherst, support Caspari and not Uphoff, and that Caspari's control group is the one you have to go with. This was a killer, because this was the man speaking and it conformed to the other published data. Now, in the report that was sent to, is very interesting, the Atomic Energy Commission with the Uphoff and Stern work, they said, in view of the former results on chronic radiation by Caspari and Stern, as well as the fact that the control rate of the present report is unexpectedly low, a final interpretation of results cannot be offered. And that's right in the paper. And then they go on in that paper to say that the control group value is particularly low, and the question may be raised whether at this initial stage of the project that it may reflect a personal bias on the experiment. And I have a feeling that Stern was throwing delta under the bus at that point. And so then there is some data that Muller sent from correspondence that I have, and said when sperm are stored in females, which is what Caspari did, there's a weekly increase in mutation frequency of about 0.07% on average. So after three weeks, the expected frequency is about 0.31. And as it turns out, it's kind of what Caspari had. Delta was about 0.16. He goes on and he says, a recalculation of my data give figures of 0.08 instead of 0.07 for the frequency of lethal accumulating male sperm per week. All these data supported the reliability of the Caspari controls. And the follow-up publications by Muller, and he had a number of them, all confirmed this, and his students did. So Caspari actually won the study. Now, but as it turns out, and you can see what Stern said. Stern says, quote, the radiation in the letter to Caspari, the radiation data continues to be puzzling. Delta's difference between control and experimental group appears to be due mainly to much lower control group values than yours. However, Muller informs me that his data give an aged control value close to yours. Thus, my first idea that your results could be explained away by assuming that your control value happened to be unusually high seems unlikely. Rather, does Delta's control group appear too low? Well, we'll have to meet. It's great to get these little letters back and forth to each other. You find out really what's going on. So basically, for the Caspari controls, Stern claimed that the Caspari control group values were aberrantly high. However, the literature and unpublished data from Muller supported Caspari. The basis of these conclusions are found in letters, cables, manuscripts, and I actually have them all. It took a while going through many libraries, but I pretty much, I think, have a complete set of all their stuff between them. So basically, trying to rid themselves of the Caspari problem, that's what he referred to Caspari in different correspondences, his data was a problem. They then decided to publish a meta-analysis. This is a critical paper of the 5 Manhattan Project experiments, the 2 by Stern, the 3 by Delta, in a science publication. It was a 1-page paper with essentially a large table. And in that, what happened is that the 2 initial Delta papers with the aberrantly low controls, they were now called normal by him. So he reinvigorated them. He didn't tell the scientific community that less than a year before in my paper in the AEC, Atomic Energy Commission bowels, more or less, that we said it was uninterpretable, that it might have been related to bias, and so forth and so on. Data that were previously uninterpretable now became interpretable. They then refloated the idea that that Caspari's data were the aberrant ones. And when you take Caspari out of the picture, you put deltas in there, and you keep Spencer's in despite its methodological problems. Guess what you get at the end of the day? A beautiful linear dose-response relationship. Now, it was only one page, and they state at the end of that page, we realize this is just a single summary of what we're doing. We will come forth with a very detailed paper with all our methods and analysis approaches and so forth and so on, so that you can see the details underlying this. They never published the follow-up paper. Okay, they never published it. And so when you take a look at the two papers that actually influenced the impact of LNT, it was the Spencer paper and it was the Uphoff paper. Caspari was essentially marginalized, trivialized, and discarded. And you can verify this by looking at citations in Web of Science and so forth and so on. And you can see when there were congressional hearings in 1957 that it was entirely the Uphoff and the Spencer papers that were cited was never the Caspari. It was the belief system came out of this work, very flawed work, manipulated work, artful dodging work out of the Stern group. Well, the interesting thing, it gets actually even more interesting because in the course of this, you can see the impact. The Caspari control study has marginalized upon rumors that its control group was aberrantly high, when in fact that it wasn't. Even 5 years after, this very prominent geneticist, Dr. Singleton, incorrectly stated that the Uphoff and Stern paper demonstrated that the control values of Caspari and Stern were spuriously high, and there was a treatment-related increase in mutation rate at that low dose rate, which was absolutely false. In the early 1950s, Muller, gets intriguing. Muller repeatedly and inexplicably claimed in writing in scientific journals that Caspari's control group was aberrantly high, when he himself, you can see from my previous slides, that he himself, his data were used that proved or supported the reliability of the Caspari controls, and his students did. Here in this and other publications, he comes back in and he attempts to say, he does say, that essentially you can't trust the Caspari work because the control group are aberrantly high. Caspari never even challenges him at this point in time. I mean, he is the man. He's got the Nobel Prize, and Caspari is probably a young assistant professor someplace. He writes in 1950, that's Muller, Uphoff and Stern have published a report of further work with doses as low as 50 rads. The results obtained are entirely in conformity with the one-hit principle. A consideration of these results together with the earlier work leads to the conclusion that the deviation first referred to, that's the challenge from Caspari's paper, was caused by a value for spontaneous mutation that happens to be unusually high. He's lying through his teeth, could easily be contradicted, be flummoxed with his own words, and actually not just his words, the data from his own lab and his own students and other people in the field. Nobody actually challenged this. Very great group of geneticists at the time. So why would Muller make such knowingly false statements repeatedly? Well, in my opinion, two things. One, he is inherently tied into supporting the LNT, and secondly, actually to protect his own reputation, because his reputation was really generated at this Nobel Prize meeting. And at that Nobel Prize meeting, there is no possibility for a threshold. If Caspari's study gets the light of day, then his deviousness and deceptiveness and lying to the Nobel Prize audience group gets revealed. He's protecting himself, and he's protecting his idea of LNT. It's a dirty story. And I have to tell you, when my first papers came out on this, a colleague of mine at the University of Massachusetts, whom I know quite well, but who's a health educator, so we just kind of talk about other stuff, never technical anything. He calls up and says, I'm really interested in your Nobel Prize paper on Muller. And I said, really? Why are you interested in anything I'm doing technically? He says, well, actually I went to graduate school with with Muller's daughter. And she's called up and wants to know who you are. Why are you trashing her dad's name? And And I want to know why you're trashing your dad's name. So I said, why don't you come on over? We took about a 2-hour walk around our campus, and I tried to tell them the story I've shared with you. I said, share it with her and have her give me a call. So in any case, this leads us now to the real action, and that's Bear One Committee, because it's coming out of the Bear One Committee that the belief of the country and the world is that linearity is real. Now, the committee was constituted in 1955. The report came out on June 12th of 1956. And essentially, I was very excited about this, actually, because I said, I got the transcripts of the Bear One Committee from the National Academy of Sciences. I wanted to listen to the brightest minds duke it out on linearity versus threshold. I want to see who won the battle. Did Muller pound his fist? Is Muller the smartest one in the room? Who gave in on threshold, and how did they jump on them? And what were the arguments for and against? This was like so exciting for me. So I got the days of the transcripts coming in and talk about, what a deflated balloon. The deflated balloon was that they didn't discuss it at all. Nothing. There was a statement of principles read by Dr. Sonneborn from the University of Indiana that stated, it was a 3 or 4 page of transcripts of the principles. The bottom line was the principles are what it's like the geneticist credo. What do we believe? We believe in essentially 4 different things. We believe that all mutation's bad, that it's irreversible, that it's cumulative, and it's linear. And that's what we believe. And basically, after that, there's nothing else to believe. It's linear at low dose. And it's actually a rather interesting situation, because in the course of it, there was no debate then on what was the basis for LNT. It was accepted. That was their belief. And they felt that they didn't have to justify it. And so what actually happened next becomes rather interesting. What happens next is that Warren Weaver decides that since they have plenty of time now, because they don't even have to debate whether linearity is real or not. It's real. It's the game. Time is, I'm going over time. Well, let me just tell you very brief summary fashion what happens in this situation. They decide to try to predict what would be the mutation risks to a population getting a certain number of rads in a single exposure. And they let all the geneticists come up with the estimated risk. And so, as it turns out, 3 of the 12 geneticists said, you can't do it, it's too much uncertainty. The other 9 did. Okay, they came up with their risks. Jim Crow was put in charge of collating and organizing everything. Jim Crow removes 3 of them on his own. And he never justifies it, but they're the 3 lowest values, and by reducing those, you reduce the variability in the estimates. And what he stressed in his writings, and I have these writings, and that is that you need to have these people, to the extent that they can agree and converge, will give confidence and belief to their recommendation of linearity. But they still had profound, large differences in their estimates of risk within and between each other. And so what happened is that they then voted, and they voted not to share their findings with the general public or the scientific community because they did not want to reveal the extent to which they disagreed amongst themselves. It's all have it in writing. Then when they wrote their technical report for the journal Science, what they did was they said, Weaver says, all the geneticists of the group were invited to provide their estimates of risk, and 6 geneticists provided estimates. I know there are 9. I have all 9. They lied in the write-up, the formal technical write-up. They only provided 6. Then they said the 6 provided an estimate, and their variability was plus or minus 10. Well, I went through their variability, and their variability was over 750-fold. It was very different. They not only fabricated, they falsified the record. And they voted on it. And then what happened is it was published. And then what happened is that 3 months later, some prominent biologists wrote to them, and they said, you never provided a written justification for linearity. You just said there is linearity. We want a justification. They then voted again and said, we're not going to provide the justification. We're going to spend our time on coming up with what research should be funded, some of them getting some of those research dollars. They then sent that memo to Detlev Bronk, who was the president of the NAS, and he accepted it. So in essence, what happened is that this BEAR-1 committee had a set of beliefs that they never, in fact, justified. When challenged, wouldn't even write the documentation. When they wrote it in Science, they actually fabricated and falsified the record. They were so big, Mr. Big, multiple Nobel Prize winners, and people just as big, too big to challenge. And so we come up sucking up to authority. And you have regulatory agencies like FDA and EPA who bought into this, and that became the foundation of LNT. It's all based on, you now know the story. I'm sorry it's a little bit long, but I think you get the point. Thank you very much.